The notebook was the first thing Eleanor Shaw reached for before the sun came up. Not because she didn't know what was in it. She could have recited every page from memory the way some people recite scripture or the names of the dead. She reached for it because holding it was the closest thing she had left to holding her father's hand. Owen Shaw had been a Cornish miner, a man who came to Pennsylvania with nothing but a canvas bag and a working knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of the earth. He had drifted west the way many men did in those years, following the scent of copper and the promise of wages that might finally stay in his pocket. He never got rich, but he understood things about the ground that most men never thought to ask about. He had died 8 years before the October morning when Eleanor opened his notebook by candlelight in the kitchen of a Montana homestead cabin, running her fingers along a page she had turned to so many times the edges had gone soft as cloth. The drawing on that page was simple: two shafts, one deep and one shallow, connected by a horizontal passage. Arrows showing how air moved through a working mine drawn in Owen's tight, careful hand. Below the diagram in the same unhurried script, a single line sent follows heat. Heat follows pressure. Pressure follows design. Eleanor set her coffee down and looked at the drawing for a long time. The cabin around her was quiet in the particular way that Montana is quiet in October, which is to say the silence has weight to it, the kind that presses down on a person and makes the ticking of a clock sound like an accusation. Outside in the small corral her husband Ben had built 3 years before he died, 3 horses stood in the cold morning air. A heavy buckskin gelding she called Garrison, a bay mare the color of autumn river water that she called Bess, and a young colt not yet a year old, still without a name. She was 32 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years. The horses were the most valuable thing she owned. They were also, as of the previous morning, the reason Walter Holt had stood on her porch and told her she had 21 days to fix what he called a public safety problem. She picked up the notebook and read the page again. Scent follows heat. Heat follows pressure. Pressure follows design. She had 21 days. Walter Holt was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. He was 52 years old and he had spent 3 decades in this valley, watching men who raised their voices lose everything they raised them about. He had learned early that real power was quiet. Real power arrived with paperwork. He came on the morning of October 3rd with a copy of the Territorial Livestock Security Ordinance folded into the breast pocket of his coat, and he stood on Eleanor Shaw's porch with the patience of a man who had already won the argument before it started. She had heard him coming. She had time to close Owen's notebook and set it on the table before she opened the door. He explained the situation the way he always explained things, in careful, measured language that left no room for misunderstanding. 4 colts had been taken by wolves from the northern pasture in a single week. The Territorial Council had responded with a new ordinance. Any livestock not secured inside a registered reinforced structure before the first hard frost would be subject to confiscation for the regional stage line. Her 3 horses, he explained, were considered a public hazard. Their presence near the inhabited lowlands was pulling the wolf pack closer to the settlement. She had 21 days to construct a standard double-wall timber stable registered with the council or the animals would be confiscated. Eleanor listened to all of it without speaking. She was watching his eyes while he talked. Holt's eyes were the eyes of a man who viewed the valley as a ledger book with columns for assets and liabilities. And Eleanor Shaw had been in the liabilities column for a long time. She was a widow without capital, working a homestead claim she had held for 3 years through stubbornness and careful management of almost nothing. She had no access to the sawmill he controlled. She had no money to hire a crew. She had a shovel and a pickaxe and the horses themselves, and the horses were the only reason she had work hauling freight on the Eastern Trail. Without the horses, there was no income. Without income, there was no way to hold the claim. And her land sat directly on a survey line for the new stage road that Holt had been pushing the council to approve for the better part of 2 years. She understood all of this while he was still talking about wolves. When he finished, she asked him one question. She asked whether he had read the full definition of reinforced structure in the ordinance text. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, small and quick, the way a card player's expression shifts when the person across the table says something they weren't supposed to know. Then he put his hat back on and told her she should start packing her trunk before the frost came down. He turned and walked back down the path to his horse. He looked at the flat, rocky ground surrounding her cabin, and he saw a foreclosed future. He did not see a construction site. He did not see anything worth measuring in that patch of earth. That was his first mistake, though he wouldn't understand it for weeks. Eleanor stood on her porch and watched him go. Then she went inside and opened her father's notebook to a different page. Sam Briggs arrived that same afternoon, and he came as a friend. He was 58 years old, the blacksmith in Copperfield, and his word carried weight on the town council the way a good anvil carries weight, steadily and without drama, for reasons that had accumulated over decades. He had known Eleanor and Ben since before the cabin was built. He had shod their horses and repaired their wagon axle and attended Ben's burial in the November mud 2 years ago, and said nothing at the graveside because there was nothing adequate to say. He came through the door with his hat in his hands and accepted the coffee she poured without ceremony. For a few minutes, they sat at the kitchen table in the kind of silence that belongs to people who have known each other long enough not to fill it with noise. Then Sam told her the truth. He said he had argued against the ordinance when it was being drafted, and he had lost. He said Holt had 4 votes on the council, and those 4 votes were not going to move. He said 21 days was not enough time for a woman without crew or capital to build a regulation stable, and everyone in the room during that vote had known it, and some of them were not proud of it. But knowing and acting were different things, and he was sorry they were. He said the most practical option, the one that gave her the best chance of holding the land, was to sell the horses to him at fair market price and enter into a temporary winter agreement with Holt that would allow her to buy them back in the spring when she had the resources to build properly. He said this quietly, without condescension, looking at his coffee cup. He meant every word of it kindly. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she stood up and lifted Owen's notebook from the table. She carried it to Sam and set it open in front of him, not to the page with the air circulation diagram, but to an earlier page, a page dense with geological notations and margin calculations that Owen Shaw had made 30 years ago about the properties of dense subsoil clay. Sam looked at it. He was a craftsman trained to read the language of material and structure, and he could see immediately that these were not casual notes. This was the technical record of a working engineer. He turned a page and found the shaft diagram. 2 openings, one deep, one shallow. A horizontal connecting passage. Arrows marking the direction and pressure of airflow. He read the line below it. Scent follows heat. Heat follows pressure. Pressure follows design. He looked up at Eleanor. She pointed at the floor. Sam looked at the floor, then at her. He was a man who had spent his entire life building things that other people could see and evaluate, things that existed in the visible world where a person could walk around them and knock on the walls and form an opinion. What Eleanor was pointing at was not a floor. She was pointing at an idea, and the idea was buried somewhere below where he was sitting. He said slowly that the principles in the notebook might work in a mine. He said, but under a cabin. Eleanor took the notebook back and said, "You think it won't work." He said, "I think I don't know." He meant it as doubt. Eleanor heard it as the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. She walked him to the door and thanked him for coming. He stood on the porch longer than necessary, looking at the flat ground round the cabin with an expression she couldn't name. Then he put his hat on and left. Riding back toward town, Sam Briggs found he couldn't stop thinking about the proportions in those drawings. The angles. The way Owen Shaw had annotated the margins with numbers that his craftsman's brain kept trying to fit into structures he knew kept trying to resolve into something that made sense in the physical world he understood. He couldn't make it work in his head. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not that it was impossible, that he couldn't tell. Eleanor waited until Sam's horse was past the tree line before she knelt down and pressed both palms flat against the wooden floor of the cabin. Ben had built this floor out of pine planks hauled from the mill 12 miles east. He had laid them on a dry stacked stone perimeter, choosing this location because of the slight elevation and its natural resistance to standing water. Ben had been a practical man in the best sense of man who looked at land and saw what it could support. He had looked at this particular patch of ground and seen drainage. Eleanor looked at it and saw volume. She took a candle and a small iron hammer and spent the next hour on her knees moving slowly across the floor, tapping each plank and listening. She was listening for hollow resonance below the wood, for the particular quality of depth that competent miners learn to read through a single tap. She found it. In a broad central section of the main room, the sound that came back was different from the perimeter planks. Lower in pitch, with an echo that spoke of space and clay beneath rather than packed rubble. She pulled up one plank near the center and held the candle down into the gap. Below the joist, below the stone foundation, the ground was a layer of blue-gray clay, dense and cold, and faintly damp at the surface, but dry as fired brick 3 inches down. This was frost-resistant subsoil, the kind that Cornish miners called dead ground, because nothing grew in it and nothing penetrated it easily. It was in the language of her father's notebook, exactly the material he had spent his working life learning to cut. She pressed her fingers into the clay and withdrew them. The impressions held their shape perfectly. She did her calculations that night by candlelight on the back of a 1875 calendar page. To shelter 3 horses comfortably, she needed a space 12 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling clearance of at least 7 feet. That meant displacing close to 1,700 cubic feet of material by hand alone in 3 weeks. This was also the moment she committed fully to understanding what she was building and why it would work, because after this night she would not allow herself to revisit the theory. Only the execution. A traditional above-ground stable functions like a chimney. The warmth generated by the animals inside rises and carries their scent upward and outward into the surrounding cold air, where a wolf can detect the heat signature from a considerable distance on a still night. The animals may be physically safe inside the walls, but their presence is announced continuously through the very ventilation that keeps them alive. There is no solution to this problem if you build upward. To hide horses from wolves, you had to hide their breath. Owen Shaw's notebook described a dual-shaft ventilation system drawn directly from deep copper mine engineering. Fresh air would enter through a stone-lined underground conduit running 50 feet from the stable chamber to an intake point hidden in a thicket behind the cabin. That intake distance was critical because it meant the incoming air would travel far enough through the earth to be warmed by the ground's constant internal temperature before reaching the animals. Warmed air carries less scent differential. Warmed air moving slowly through an underground passage loses its cold air character entirely by the time it arrives. The exhaust system was the more intricate piece. Rather than venting through a dedicated shaft rising above ground where any heat plume would be visible, and any scent detectable, the warm exhaled air from the horses would be routed through a horizontal underground conduit connecting to the existing fireplace chimney above. The convective pull of the fire would draw the air upward. Any organic scent molecules in that air would be combusted in the flames or masked entirely by the strong, consistent odor of burning hardwood. The horses would breathe through the cabin's own lungs, and no nose in the valley, human or otherwise, would find them. The physics required no mechanical assistance. Air moves from high pressure to low. Heat rises and seeks the path of least resistance. Owen Shaw had not invented these principles. He had simply spent a lifetime learning to arrange the conditions under which they worked in his favor. Eleanor closed the notebook. She would not open to that page again. She had what she needed from it. Everything from here forward was execution. She sat in the dark for a long time listening to the horses outside. She was afraid. She understood, sitting in the silence, that her father's theory had been developed in the context of fully equipped mining operations, with engineering crews, timber supports, and decades of accumulated testing. She was proposing to replicate the essential principles of that system alone underground in 3 weeks with hand tools. She sat with that fear without trying to move it. Then she lit the candle again and began her materials list. Deputy Roy Crane came 3 days later. He was 26 years old, and he had been working under Holt's indirect influence long enough to understand how a company town arranges its authority without ever putting that arrangement on paper. The sheriff answered to the county. The county's largest taxpayer was Walter Holt. The arithmetic of that relationship had consequences Roy had spent 2 years trying not to examine too carefully. He came to Eleanor's door on the morning of October 6th with a clipboard and the official expression of a man performing a routine inspection. He noted the empty corral. He noted the absence of any visible construction activity. No lumber had been delivered. No planks were stacked. No framing had begun. He asked if she needed the names of contractors working at council-approved rates. Eleanor said she had the matter in hand. He wrote something in his notes and walked the property perimeter, looking at the cabin walls, the woodshed, the ground. He was methodical. He looked at everything there was to look at. On his way back to his horse, he passed within 10 yards of Eleanor, who was pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with dark earth toward the creek behind the property. He stopped. He looked at the wheelbarrow. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the creek. The wheelbarrow was loaded with subsoil, the same blue-gray clay he had seen in road cuts through the valley. That specific clay did not appear in wheelbarrows by chance. It required deliberate excavation from somewhere below ground level. There was nothing being built on this property, no foundation hole, no visible excavation anywhere. Roy Crane stood in that silence for a moment. Then he walked to his horse, opened his clipboard, and wrote, "No construction, progress. Property cleared of livestock." He did not write anything about the wheelbarrow. He rode back toward town, trying to identify the nature of the choice he had just made. He had not lied. He had declined to speculate. That was what he told himself. He suspected it was not entirely accurate. He also suspected the fuller truth of it would become clear with time, and that for now, riding away from a homestead where a woman was doing something he didn't understand was the closest he was going to get to acting on whatever it was he believed in. He had spent 2 years in this valley waiting for a moment like that. It was smaller than he had expected. Most meaningful things are. Martha Greer came the following morning with a dried apple cake on a plate covered in cloth, and she came with something else beneath it folded inside her expression, like a letter inside an envelope. She was 44, a widow managing a 40-acre spread half a mile east, and she had been kind during the months after Ben died. She had brought food and sat quietly and said the right things. Eleanor had appreciated it genuinely. Martha sat at the kitchen table and made conversation about the weather and the price of hay for a few minutes. Then she said what she had come to say. She said she had noticed Eleanor moving considerable amounts of earth from somewhere on the property to the creek over the past few days. She said she was worried this might look suspicious to people who weren't as understanding as she was. She said she would be happy to speak to Walter Holt on Eleanor's behalf as a concerned neighbor to make sure there was no misunderstanding about what was happening here. She said all of this with genuine warmth in her voice. Eleanor understood what the warmth was covering. Martha Greer owed Walter Holt a significant sum from a cattle purchase gone wrong the previous spring. It was not public knowledge, but this valley was small, and information traveled through it the way water travels, finding every available channel. Eleanor had known about the debt since before Ben died. Ben had mentioned it without judgment as simply a thing that was true about the world they lived in. Eleanor thanked Martha for the cake. She said everything was being handled in accordance with the ordinance requirements. She said she was confident the council would find the property in compliance when the time came. Martha left with a smile that was exactly right in all the wrong ways. Eleanor waited until she heard the wagon moving back toward the road. Then she made two changes quietly and without anger. She moved the hour she transferred earth to the creek from late afternoon to 3 in the morning. And she relocated the hidden floor entry to the excavation beneath the corner shelving unit, where accessing it required moving furniture and would not be visible from any window. She did not feel contempt for Martha. She felt clarity, the kind that comes when the number of people you can trust becomes small enough to count without using both hands. She had work to do. The night of October 7th, when the moon was behind clouds and the temperature had dropped below freezing for the first time that season, Eleanor Shaw pulled up the planks beneath her corner shelves, lowered herself into the gap with a candle, a pickaxe, and a bucket, and began. She did not think about the scale of what she was attempting. She had learned early that the only way to approach something enormous is to reduce it to the next individual action. Her father had said this about mining. You don't dig a mine, Owen Shaw had told her when she was 10 years old. You move one bucket, then you move another. The mine happens while you're thinking about the bucket. The first swing of the pickaxe struck the clay and rang back up through her arms with a resistance that told her two things. The material was exactly what she had calculated, and this was going to be the hardest physical work she had ever done. She filled the first bucket in 11 minutes. She climbed out of the hole, carried it through the dark cabin to the back door, and walked it to the creek in the dark. She moved close to the tree line. She moved without a lantern. She tipped the bucket and watched the clay dissolve in the moving water and carry downstream. Then she walked back to the cabin and lowered herself into the hole. The neighbors who passed on the road in the days that followed would see a woman who appeared to spend her time cleaning her house and hauling small loads of earth to the creek. They would hear no hammering. They would see no lumber. They would see no stable taking shape above the ground. They would assume she had given up. She had not given up. She was afraid, and afraid was not the same thing as finished. She had learned that distinction somewhere in the 2 years since she buried her husband, and it was, she believed, the most useful thing grief had ever taught her. Below the floor of the cabin, in the cold dark, in the company of a candle, and her father's voice in her memory, Eleanor Shaw moved one bucket, then another. The open loop, as Owen had called it in the notebook, referring to the start of any tunnel, any shaft, any space carved from solid earth, was the moment a person committed. Before the first swing, there were still options. After it, there was only the direction forward. She had chosen forward. The mine would happen while she was thinking about the bucket. By the 14th day, Eleanor Shaw's hands had become a document. The palms were mapped in burst blisters and new calluses the color of old bone. The skin at the base of each finger had cracked along the joints and sealed itself with dried clay the color of old bruises. She had stopped examining them directly the way a person learns to stop looking at a wound that is healing, but not yet healed. Looking at them would mean measuring the cost, and measuring the cost was not something she could afford. What she could afford was the next bucket. She had moved her working hours to the time after midnight following Martha Greer's visit. The creek received its loads of subsoil in the dark now in the hard cold that had settled below freezing every night, while the valley slept and asked no questions. The neighbors who passed on the road during daylight hours saw only a woman making quiet peace with an outcome they believed had already been decided. They saw her moving small, unhurried loads of earth to the creek. They saw a woman putting her affairs in order before the deadline arrived and took what it was owed. They had built a story around the evidence available to them. The story was the widow Shaw had quit. Eleanor was grateful for the story. It was the most useful thing they had given her. Below the floor of the cabin, the chamber had grown in the dark. The south wall stood at its full height, now clay-pressed smooth by her palms curved at the ceiling, where she had begun shaping the arch that her father's notebook described in the margins. She was not moving fast. She was moving correctly, and in the world Owen Shaw had taught her, those were not the same thing. She thought about the next bucket. The chamber was thinking about becoming a room. On the eighth evening, she was pushing the wheelbarrow toward the creek when she saw the boy. He was sitting on a flat rock at the edge of the water with a young bay colt beside him, and the colt's right foreleg was bent at an angle that told Eleanor everything she needed to know before she reached them. She set the wheelbarrow handles down and walked over without being asked. The boy looked up. He was 16 or 17, dark-haired, with the particular expression of someone working very hard not to appear frightened. She recognized the Holt jawline immediately. She had studied Walter Holt's face enough over the past week to know what it looked like at 17. She said nothing about that. She knelt beside the colt and ran her hands down the injured leg with the unhurried care of someone who had been doing this since she was old enough to reach a horse's knee. Wire cut, not a break. It had bled considerably and was beginning to close badly. She took a length of clean cotton from her coat pocket, where she had taken to keeping it, and a small tin of pine oil from her jacket. She cleaned the wound and bandaged it without speaking. The boy watched her work. He looked at the wheelbarrow. He looked at the load of blue-gray subsoil sitting in it. He looked at the cabin barely visible through the trees. He was a rancher's son. He understood exactly what that clay was and where it came from. He stood up, without a word, walked to the wheelbarrow, and picked up the handles. He emptied it into the creek while Eleanor secured the bandage. When he came back, she was ready to load it again. He stood there. She did not thank him. She did not ask his name. She loaded the wheelbarrow, and he took the handles, and they walked to the creek in the dark. They did this 3 more times before the cold drove him back toward his horse. When he gathered the colt's reins, he paused and looked at her, and there was something in his face that sat in the territory of a question without quite being one. She said, "Come back tomorrow if you want, or don't." He nodded once and led the colt into the dark. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the cabin and the hole beneath it and the work waiting below. That night, James Holt arrived home late and went directly to his room. His father found him at the supper table with clay on his hands and asked what he had been doing. Jimmy said he had been repairing fence line on the east pasture. It was the first lie he had told his father that he could remember. He said it clearly without hesitation, and the ease of it unsettled him, the way a discovered capability sometimes can, particularly when you discover it in yourself. He sat through supper thinking about a woman working alone in the dark on something he could not fully name, and the clay drying under his fingernails felt less like evidence and more like a decision he had already made without quite meaning to. On the 14th night, Eleanor's system failed. She was working the west section of the chamber wall at 2 in the morning, setting the final course of stone on a stretch she had been building for 3 days, when a 6-foot section came down. Not in a crash. Slower than that, and slower was worse. The wall leaned held for one long second, in which she had time to understand exactly what was happening, and then released. Stone and packed clay came down in a controlled slide that hit the floor and filled the air with a pale fine dust. She was already moving when it fell. She pressed herself against the opposite wall, and the material passed close enough to cover her boots. Then it was done. The dust settled. The candle had survived. She stood in the wreckage for a long moment, breathing carefully. Then she sat down as the rubble. She had been expecting something to go wrong. 14 days of continuous underground work, and nothing had gone wrong, and she had understood intellectually that the odds on that were not indefinitely sustainable. But expecting a thing and experiencing it are separated by a distance that no amount of intellectual preparation can close. She sat in the rubble and felt that distance. She had not cried since Ben's burial. For 2 years she had maintained a careful distance from her own grief, not because she didn't feel it, but because she understood the way you understand certain structural things by living in a house long enough that grief requires an opening to move through, and she could not afford to provide one. The wall she had built around it was made of work and planning, and the next task and the task after that, and she had maintained it without examining it, because examining a load-bearing wall requires you to stop leaning on it first. Sitting in the rubble of the west wall at 2 in the morning with clay dust settling on her shoulders, she felt the wall she had built around 2 years of grief, and knew it had the same problem as the wall she was sitting in front of. It was built straight when it needed to follow the natural line of something underneath. She said out loud to the empty chamber, to a man who had been dead for 8 years, "Dad, I read it wrong. Tell me what I'm missing." The silence of deep earth came back at her. Nothing else. She sat with it. Then she reached into the rubble and picked up a handful of clay from the fallen section. She pressed it in her palm, worked it, felt the texture and give of it. Then she stood up and crossed to the east wall, the wall that had not moved in 2 weeks, and pressed her fingers into the clay there. The difference was in her hand before it was in her mind. The clay from the fallen section was wetter. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way that 14 days of daily contact with this specific material had calibrated her palms to register differences that her eyes could not see. There was a moisture differential running through the west wall section, a thin vein of subsoil with a higher water content than the material around it, the kind of feature that appears when underground water tables shift gradually over years and leave behind a trace of their movement. The clay in that zone could not hold the geometry she had been imposing on it. The arch she needed there had to follow the moisture seam's natural path, irregular and asymmetrical, rather than the clean geometry she had planned. Her father had written about this, not as a warning, as a simple observation about the nature of Earth when it resists. Stop asking why it isn't cooperating. Ask what it's trying to tell you. The west wall was not a failure. It was information she had not known how to receive until it was delivered at volume. She stood up. She brushed the dust from her coat. She picked up the trowel. It took the rest of that night to clear the fallen material. She did not sleep. She worked until the sky outside the cabin went from black to dark gray, then climbed up through the floor, sealed the entry, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee. Her hands were trembling from sustained effort, the body finally requiring the mind to acknowledge it. She sat until the trembling stopped. Then she went back down. The west wall rebuilt along the moisture seam's actual path took 2 more days. It was not as clean as she had planned. It was the right wall. There is a difference. On the 16th day, Walter Holt called Roy Crane into his office. He did not offer Roy a seat. He stood behind his desk and explained what he needed in the same measured tone he used for all business, which was a tone that hid its pressure in its steadiness. He said there had been reports of irregular activity at the Shaw homestead, and he needed Roy to conduct a premises inspection, including the interior of the cabin, to confirm compliance with the ordinance. He said he needed it done without waiting for formal paperwork. Roy stood in front of that desk and looked at a point 6 inches above Holt's shoulder while he processed the request. He had spent 2 years conducting the visible work of Holt's invisible influence, and he had sustained himself in that position by maintaining a private distinction between legal and right, which was not a distinction that held up well under extended examination, but which had been functional enough as long as he didn't examine it directly. He was examining it now. He told Holt he was ready to conduct the inspection. He said he would need a written directive countersigned by the sheriff, given that an interior premises search on a homestead claim required county-level authorization under the Territorial Settlement Code. He said he could circulate the paperwork within 5 days, accounting for normal processing time at the county office. Holt looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite anger. It was the expression of a man recalibrating a calculation that had appeared settled. Roy held still. Holt said he would be in touch and turned toward the window. Roy put his hat on and left. He stood in the October cold outside for a while, not moving. He had just placed 5 days between Walter Holt and Eleanor Shaw's front door, and he had done it using the one tool available to him that Holt could not override without creating a legal problem larger than the one he was trying to solve. The tool was procedure. It was small and bureaucratic, and it was the only honest instrument in the room. He thought about the wheelbarrow he had seen 12 days ago and chosen not to document. He thought about the blue-gray clay it was loaded with. He thought about the way Eleanor Shaw had looked at him when he asked if she needed contractor references. Not defiant, not frightened, just steady, in the way that people are steady when they have committed to a direction and are no longer available for redirection. He walked back to his office and sat at his desk. He did not write anything in his report. The 5 days he had created were not his. They belonged to someone who had a better use for them than he did. Jimmy Holt came back the following evening, and the evening after that, and the 3 evenings after that. He never announced himself. He arrived at the creek at dusk, and either the wheelbarrow was there to be emptied or it wasn't. Eleanor had stopped walking with him. She was too far into the chamber work to break the rhythm, and Jimmy had understood after the second night that instructions and explanations were not part of the arrangement. He came because he chose to come. He worked because the work was there. The entire exchange existed in that simplicity. On the evening of the 17th day, he arrived to find Eleanor sitting outside the back door with Owen's notebook open on her knee, a stick of charcoal in her hand. She was making marks on a page with the focused expression of someone working through a problem that resists resolution. He sat nearby and waited. After a while, she turned the notebook so he could see. She had drawn a cross-section of the chamber below and the cabin above, showing the planned connection between the underground exhaust conduit and the existing chimney stack. The issue was annotated in short, direct notes. Warm air from the horses needed to enter the chimney below the fire grate and be drawn upward by the natural convective pull of the flame. But the geometry of the junction created a back pressure zone that would periodically reverse the flow direction, pushing air back down into the chamber rather than drawing it out. She tapped the annotation with the charcoal and looked at him. Jimmy looked at the drawing. He had spent 6 weeks the previous summer working with a German mason named Richter, who had been repairing a mill chimney on the east side of the county. Richter was a difficult man by temperament and a precise one by training, and he had a specific solution for back pressure problems in chimney junctions, involving a small angle deflector positioned just before the meeting point, creating what he called a windbreaker chamber, a small equalization space that absorbed the pressure differential before it could reverse the flow. Jimmy took the charcoal from Eleanor's hand without asking. He drew a short diagonal line across the junction point in her diagram, angled at approximately 15 degrees with a small rectangular space indicated on the upstream side of it. He wrote next to it in his blocky, careful hand, pressure equalization before junction. Richter called it windbreaker. Eleanor studied the addition for a long time. She said, "Where did you learn this?" He said a mason named Richter, East County. He called it a windbreaker chamber. She looked at the drawing again. The 15-degree angle would redirect the incoming airstream enough to eliminate the back pressure formation without reducing the convective draw from above. It was the kind of solution that belonged to the vocabulary of chimney work and would never occur to someone who had spent their life thinking about mines. She had spent 3 days on this problem. This boy had drawn the answer in under a minute. She handed him the charcoal back and looked at the creek. After a while, Jimmy said, "Was my father wrong about you?" She did not answer immediately. Then she said, "Your father believes that what is true is what a person can see. That is not wrong, it is just not complete." Jimmy sat with that for a while. He said he's going to lose this one, isn't he? Eleanor stood up, closed the notebook, and went back inside without answering. That night, working the chimney junction with the geometry Jimmy had sketched, she built the deflector from a flat piece of limestone and a wedge of compacted clay set at the angle he had indicated, mortared into place with the same lime and clay mixture her father had used for mine shaft linings. When she held a lit match near the junction, the flame bent consistently toward the chimney opening. No reversal, steady draw. She sat back in the narrow passage and looked at that small, bending flame for a moment. The thing worked because the physics demanded that it work. She had arranged the conditions correctly. A 17-year-old boy had given her the missing piece without being asked, and the piece had come from a German mason. Neither of them would ever see again, and the knowledge had traveled from that mason's hands to Jimmy's memory, to her wall, and now it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do without caring at all about the route it had taken to get there. She thought about her father, about the way knowledge moves through time when it moves through people rather than books, about what it means to give someone something that will outlast the giving. She put the match out and went back to work. On the evening of the 19th day, Sam Briggs rode past Eleanor's cabin on the road back from the forge. He had not planned to stop. He had done what he came to do 10 days ago, given Eleanor his honest assessment and his best offer, and she had declined it. Whatever happened next was between her and the calendar. He stopped anyway. He sat on his horse at the edge of the road and looked at the cabin in the fading light. Smoke from the chimney pale against the darkening sky. Nothing unusual in the image itself. He took out the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket for dimensions and material calculations, and he looked at an entry he had made 2 days prior when he had ridden this same road at this same hour and noticed something he could not account for. What he had written was draw rate elevated for fire volume, 20 to 30% above expected output for a single-person household. Two possible explanations: chimney flaw, creating excessive draft, or other. He had written or other because he was a craftsman, and craftsmen do not leave unresolved observations unrecorded simply because the explanation isn't available yet. He looked at the entry now in the diminishing light and thought about what he knew. An elevated draw rate in a residential chimney indicated one of two conditions. Either the chimney had a structural flaw that was creating a wider draw than the fire volume required, which would present as inconsistent smoke output and increased fuel consumption, or something below the chimney was creating supplemental convective pull, a secondary heat source or airflow that was feeding the draft from beneath. He thought about Owen Shaw's notebook, the horizontal conduit connecting underground to the vertical chimney stack, the arrows marking airflow direction. He put the notebook away and rode home. He was a practical man. He did not build his reputation on conclusions he couldn't demonstrate with his hands. But he also understood, after 4 decades of working with material and structure, that there is a specific quality to the feeling a person gets when all the pieces of something are in the same room before they have been connected. He had that feeling now, and it sat in him with a density that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with recognition. He thought about it all the way home. He thought about it while he ate. He thought about it when he blew out the lamp. He was still thinking about it when sleep finally arrived. On the night of October 23rd, one day before the deadline, Eleanor Shaw led 3 horses underground. She used oats, not rope. Ropes meant resistance, and resistance meant sound. And sound was the one thing she could not afford in the dark, with other farms a quarter-mile in every direction. She moved backward down the spiral ramp, one slow step at a time. Her hand extended the oats, replenishing from her coat pocket, her breath making small clouds in the cold that had settled hard over the valley since sundown. Garrison went first, as she had expected. He was a steady animal composed by nature and by years of work that had asked him to trust the person holding his lead. He descended the ramp with only a brief pause at the entry, his shod hooves muffled by the 6 inches of compacted sand and pine needles she had laid along the tunnel floor weeks ago, with exactly this moment in mind. Bess required more patience. She stopped twice on the ramp, ears forwarded, reading the confined air and the darkness, and with the full attention of a creature whose survival had always depended on assessing what it should not see. Eleanor stood still both times and let her. On the second stop, she held an open palm near Bess's muzzle and waited. Bess made her decision on her own terms. She walked the rest of the ramp without stopping. The colt came last. Eleanor had told herself she would name him after this was over, when there was something to mark other than survival. But standing at the top of the ramp in the dark, with him pressing his nose against her shoulder, looking down into the lamplight of the chamber below, she made a decision that had been forming for longer than she had admitted to herself. She said it quietly between just the two of them. Owen, she led him down. She stayed in the chamber for a while after all 3 horses settled, not because anything required it. The physics was working on its own terms, and she could feel the temperature shifting within minutes as 3 sets of lungs began the slow work of warming the enclosed air. She sat with her back against the east wall and listened to the sounds she had built this room to contain, and in the listening she found something she had not anticipated. Not triumph, something quieter than that. The feeling of a thing having become what it was meant to be. Eleanor climbed back through the floor. She worked the pulley system she had built from seasoned oak and leather strap, and the flooring section rose on its hinges and settled back into place. She checked the seams twice with her fingertips, pressing along each edge, verifying the fit. From inside the cabin, there was no indication anything lay below. From outside the cabin, the 3 horses she had owned for 3 years had, to all visible evidence, ceased to exist. She sat in the chair nearest the fireplace and waited. After a few minutes, she heard it, rising through the boards, through the clay and stone and the architecture. Her father's knowledge had made possible the slow, rhythmic sound of 3 horses chewing in the dark below her. Garrison's heavy, deliberate jaw, Bess's quicker, efficient rhythm, and beneath both of them, quieter, the young sound of Owen still learning how much to take at once. The sound of a system working. She sat with it until the fire burned low and the room cooled, then added 1 careful log and sat again. Not triumphant, not relieved. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The specific feeling of having arranged conditions correctly and of the world having answered. The deadline was 24 hours away. She went to the window. The sky to the northwest, which had been clear and cold all week, had changed. Not dramatically, I mean, not with wind or the usual theater of approaching weather. It had changed in color, the blue-black of a cold October night, giving way at the edges to something deeper, a bruised and pressurized purple that she recognized without wanting to. Her father had told her once what a sky that color meant. He had told her the way he told her most important things without ceremony, looking at something else while he said it. He had said that color means the world is about to tighten, that something has been building in the north for a long time and the sky is the last thing to show it before the ground finds out. She stood at the window and looked at that sky for a long moment. 24 hours to the deadline, and something else was coming, moving on a different calendar than Walter Holt's ordinance, and cared nothing about property claims or council votes or the legal definition of protection. Below her feet, 3 horses breathed in the dark through the lungs of the cabin. Above the mountains, the sky continued to deepen toward a color that had no good name in any language she knew. She did not sleep that night. The morning of October 24th carried the color of that sky from the night before, still sitting at the edges of the horizon. The bruised purple had drained away, but left something behind in the quality of the air, a heaviness that settled on the valley like an exhaled breath that didn't rise again. Sam Briggs arrived at Eleanor's place on horseback before 8, accompanied by 2 men from the council. He had the ordinance in his breast pocket. He had his notebook in the other. He did what the ordinance required. He walked the perimeter of the property with professional thoroughness, noting the empty corral, the absence of any livestock structure, the condition of the land. His 2 companions did the same, making their own notes, looking at the horizon for horses that weren't there. Sam walked the ground behind the cabin where a path led through a stand of juniper toward the creek. He paused near the juniper thicket and looked at the ground. There was something about the soil here, the way it had been disturbed recently and then carefully pressed flat again. Not obvious. If you were not a craftsman who noticed the texture of surface as a matter of professional habit, you would not have seen it. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked back toward the cabin and around to the front where Eleanor was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, dressed as if a man with a compliance form was roughly the 14th most interesting thing scheduled to happen to her that day. He asked where the horses were. She said they are no longer a concern of the council. He looked at the empty corral and then at her. He said what the situation required him to say, which was that hiding livestock in the canyon country was not a long-term strategy, that the wolves would locate them before nightfall, and that Holt intended to file a claim on the property if she could not demonstrate the means to secure her animals. Then he said the line that would follow him for the rest of his life, repeated in later years by people who had not been there: "You cannot beat winter with a shovel, Mrs. Shaw." Eleanor looked at the empty ground between them. She said they are where the wolves cannot reach them. Sam wrote it down in his notebook. He wrote what the ordinance required: property cleared of livestock, no visible structure, compliance with the letter of the law. He added one personal notation that he would not submit to Holt. Mrs. Shaw's statement accepted. Location of animals unknown. Soil disturbance noted northeast of cabin, inconclusive. He put the notebook away and walked back to his horse. Halfway there, crossing the flat ground between the juniper thicket and the road, he stopped without quite knowing why. He stood still for a moment. Under his boots, through the sole of his shoe, there was a sensation so faint he could not be certain it was real. A low, rhythmic shift in the ground, like something settling or breathing in the earth below him. He looked down at his boots. He looked at the flat, unremarkable ground. Then he walked to his horse and mounted. He rode back toward town without speaking to the two men who rode with him. 50 feet away, beneath the floor of the cabin behind him, Owen the colt had shifted his weight from one foreleg to the other, just settling, just standing in the warmth, just doing what horses do when they feel safe. The Great Freeze of 1878 arrived on the 14th of November. No one who was there would forget the speed of it. By noon that day, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees from the morning reading. By mid-afternoon, water left in a bucket on a porch was solid ice in under an hour. The sky turned the color of iron and stayed that color, and the wind that came down from the northern mountains had a specific quality to it. Not the cold of a typical winter storm, but the cold of something that had been building for a long time and had finally reached the place it was headed. Across the valley, ranchers who had been certain their structures were adequate discovered in the space of a few hours what certainty is worth when the physics do not share it. Barns that had stood for 10 years began to groan. Animals pressed against leeward walls and called out in the dark. Eleanor Shaw stayed inside her cabin and kept a modest fire. On the second night of the freeze, working by feel in the dark chamber below her floor, she found the crack. It was at the base of the south wall, a hairline fracture following the path where two different soil densities met the kind of stress response that occurs when extreme surface cold reaches down far enough to create differential contraction in a structure that spans both warmer and cooler ground. The crack was not structural. It was 3 feet long and perhaps a quarter-inch wide, and it was stable for now, but stable for now and stable for winter were not the same thing. She worked in complete silence. The horses were 3 feet from her on both sides. She did not use the lantern. She worked by touch alone, packing a mixture of clay and limestone powder into the fracture with her fingers, working slowly enough not to disturb the animals, pressing each section of material into place with the patient precision of someone who has learned that the work goes better when you stop hurrying it. Garrison stood still the entire time, as if he understood the situation required it. Bess shifted once, and Eleanor placed a hand on her flank without stopping her other work, and Bess settled. Owen watched her in the dark with the attentiveness that young animals have when they trust the person with them but haven't yet learned to stop paying attention to the world. She worked for 2 hours. When she was done, she ran her fingers along the length of the repair and felt no gap. She climbed back up through the floor, replaced the boards, and sat at the kitchen table in the warm cabin. Outside, the storm was entering its second day. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero and still dropping. Below her feet, 3 horses stood in the warmth of the earth. The wolves came on the third night. Eleanor heard them before she saw them, a sound that was not quite howling and not quite silence, the particular low chorus of a large pack moving with unified purpose. She went to the window and counted what the moonlight on the snow allowed her to count. 25, perhaps 30 animals moving from the northern tree line down across the open ground of the valley in the organized and unhurried way of animals that have decided to go somewhere. They came through her property. The lead wolf, a gray animal with the particular posture of a creature that has never had a reason to be cautious in open ground, moved through the empty corral and paused in the center of it. Its nose worked the frozen air. It turned in a slow circle, reading the wind, reading the ground, reading everything the landscape was offering. Eleanor watched from the window without moving. The wolf was standing on the ground directly above the southern end of the underground chamber. Below the frozen surface, below 3 feet of snow, below the frost line, Garrison and Bess and Owen stood in air that moved through an underground conduit and was cleaned by fire before it left the earth. There was nothing in the air above that ground to find. The wolf circled twice. Then it lowered its head, turned, and moved on. The pack followed. They crossed the property and moved east, following the scent of something they could actually locate. Eleanor stayed at the window until the last of them had passed the far fence line and disappeared into the tree line. Then she sat down. She had built a system out of physics and earth and her father's knowledge in 3 weeks of physical work that should have been impossible, and the system had just done exactly what physics demanded it do. She felt something she had not expected, something quieter than she had anticipated. Not elation, not vindication, something closer to completion. She added a log to the fire and listened to the storm. On the morning of the fifth day, the silence broke. Eleanor heard it from inside, shouting and the uneven, labored sound of a horse that was moving wrong. She went to the window and saw them coming through the drifts. Walter Holt and two of his men, and behind them a gray gelding that was walking with the desperate, spent movement of an animal that had been in severe cold for too long. The horse's knees were trembling. Its coat was wet and rigid with ice. It was the only horse Holt had managed to save. His timber stables, built to the regulation standard he had enforced on others, had failed. The double-wall pine construction, adequate in a normal winter, had not been adequate for 40 below zero sustained over 4 days. 3 of the 5 structures on his property had partially collapsed under the snow load. The animals inside had frozen or scattered. A wolf pack had broken through a snow-blocked door and taken 2 more. He crossed her yard and knocked on her door. Eleanor opened it. The warmth that came out of the cabin was not the concentrated heat of a banked furnace or a coal stove burning at capacity. It was gentler than that and steadier, the kind of warmth that a body registers as sustainable rather than fierce. Holt stepped inside and stood in it. He pulled off his glove and held his hand up, checking the air. His expression was the expression of a man whose instruments are telling him something they should not be able to tell him. He looked for the source. He looked at the fire, which was modest burning at the level of a fire maintained for cooking, not survival. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the small woodpile beside the hearth. He found nothing that explained the warmth. He looked at Eleanor. She was standing beside the kitchen table, watching him with an expression that contained nothing he could use. Not gloating, not pity, not fear, just attention. Sam Briggs, who had come with Holt because there was nowhere better to be in a storm of this severity, and because some part of him had been waiting for this moment since October, walked to the center of the room and went quiet in the particular way of a craftsman who has stopped listening to what he expected and started listening to what was actually there. He knelt down and placed his palm flat on the floor. He stayed that way for several seconds. Then he looked up at Eleanor. He said, "It's breathing." His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man saying something out loud that he had been approaching privately for weeks, and the saying of it finally made it real. Holt crossed to the fireplace and looked at the back of it. He could see now what he had not seen before. The back wall of the firebox had been modified. 3 flat stones positioned with precise care at angles that someone not looking for them would never notice redirected the airflow in the chimney in a way that served a purpose he could not yet name. He turned to Eleanor. He said, "Where are they?" His voice was different from his October voice. The October voice had been the voice of procedure and authority and a plan already executed. This voice was something else, the voice of a man who has lost the thing he was most certain of and is not yet certain what remains. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She waited while the wind hit the north wall of the cabin with enough force to shutter the window glass. The sound of it filled the room for a moment, a reminder of what 40 below could do to anything that was not adequately protected. Then she spoke. She said, "You came in October with a requirement, a structure that could protect livestock from the elements and from predators. You looked for a stable because you believed that safety is something you build upward." She paused. "I knew it was something you go into." She walked to the center of the room. She reached down and took hold of an iron ring set flush with the floor, so flush that the grain of the wood ran over it without interruption, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. The pulley system engaged with a low rhythmic groan of oak under load. A 6-foot section of the floor rose on its leather hinges and folded back. A wave of warm, moist air moved upward through the opening. It carried the smell of hay and animal warmth and the specific living quality of 3 horses standing in the dark below. Holt and Sam both stepped back. Below, hanging from a timber, set between 2 stone pillars, a single oil lantern cast its light across the chamber. The walls were clay, fired smooth. The ceiling was a dray-stacked limestone arch built without mortar, its geometry so precise that the weight of the cabin and the snow above only pressed the stones more firmly into place. The floor was clean sand. 3 horses stood in that light and looked up. Garrison, composed as he had always been, returned the attention without concern. Bess turned her ears forward, and Owen, the young colt without history, yet raised his head and looked directly at Walter Holt with a steadiness that his months of life should not have given him. Holt looked at the colt for a long time. He said nothing. Sam went down first. He took the lantern and moved slowly through the chamber, running his hands along the surfaces with the focused attention of someone reading a text he had been trying to locate for a long time. He pressed his fingers into the fired clay wall and felt its density. He looked up at the limestone arch and traced its line with his eyes, following the geometry from haunch to crown. He found the intake conduit and followed it with his hand to where it turned underground. He found the exhaust passage and traced it to the point where it connected to the chimney system above. He did not need Eleanor to explain any of it. He was a craftsman. He was reading the work of another craftsman, and the reading was clear. He turned to face Holt, who was still standing at the edge of the opening above, looking down. He said, "This is not just a hole in the ground. It is a mine. She has built a mine for the living." Holt looked at the 3 horses. He looked at the arch. He looked at the walls. He was a man who lived in the visible world and organized his authority through what he could see and measure and claim. The chamber below him existed in a category he had no framework for. He could not confiscate animals that were more securely sheltered than any livestock in the territory. He could not file a claim on a property whose owner had satisfied the requirements of the ordinance in a way the ordinance had never anticipated but could not exclude. His case had required her failure. She had not failed. He put his hat back on and walked to the door without speaking. He took his surviving horse and his 2 men, and he left. The sound of the door closing was not a dramatic sound. It was just the sound of a door closing. Sometimes that is all a thing needs to be. When the snow began to melt in late February, the change in the valley was visible within days. The neighbors who had watched Eleanor move small loads of earth through October and concluded she had given up, began to arrive at her door with measuring tape and paper. Not to offer sympathy, not to ask about her winter, to ask about dimensions, about the ratio of clay to lime she had used for the wall treatment, about the angle of the drainage slope in the ramp. They came with the specific and focused energy of people who have understood recently and completely that they had been solving the wrong problem. Eleanor received them as Owen Shaw had always received a technical problem, directly without sentiment and with the assumption that the person asking had the capacity to understand the answer. She showed them how to read a soil section for moisture content before committing to a wall design. She showed them how to calculate the thermal mass needed to maintain a stable temperature for one animal through a sustained cold event. She did not charge for the knowledge. She also did not deliver it with any performance of generosity. It was simply information, and information existed to be transferred to people who needed it. Martha Greer came on a Wednesday in March alone without anything in her hands. She stood at the door and said, "I was wrong about you." Eleanor stepped back and held the door open. Martha came in. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not discuss October in any detail because some things are more completely settled by the work than they could ever be by the conversation about it. Martha left an hour later. That spring, she began digging below her own barn floor. She finished it before the first frost of the following year. Sam Briggs came in April when the ground had dried enough to be comfortable to walk on, and he sat at Eleanor's table and opened his own notebook. He looked at the numbers he had written there in October. The estimated volume of material displaced the number of days available, the working hours of a single person. He did the arithmetic again, the way he had been doing it periodically since February. The numbers still didn't work. He looked up at Eleanor and said, "The mathematics require more than one person." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Someone help me," without being asked. "I am not going to say who." Sam looked at his notebook. He looked out the window in the direction of the Holt property, which was visible from Eleanor's kitchen on a clear day. Then he closed the notebook and put it away. He said, "I think I know who learned more from those nights than anyone else in this valley." Eleanor said nothing, but she did not look away from him, and that was its own kind of answer. James Holt spent that spring working in Sam Briggs' forge. He had asked his father for permission and received it with a silence that was not approval, but was not refusal either. By summer, he was doing the work of a second-year apprentice. By the following year, when he was 19, he drew the drainage plans for a new section of the Eastern Settlement Road, using principles he had worked out in his head on a series of cold October evenings behind a woman's cabin, carrying loads of blue-gray clay in the dark. Walter Holt moved south 2 years after the winter of 1878. He said it was for the range conditions. The people who had known him for 30 years understood that range conditions were not the reason, but they let him have the explanation because everyone deserves something to take with them. Deputy Roy Crane submitted a formal resignation from his county appointment in the spring of 1879 and took a position with the Territorial Surveyor's Office in the county seat, independent of any private influence. He did this without ceremony or announcement. On his last day, he rode past Eleanor Shaw's property. On the road, looked at the cabin, and kept riding. He had done what he was able to do when it mattered. He did not require her to know about it, and she did not. By the autumn of 1879, 7 ranches in the valley had begun excavating underground stable systems based on Eleanor Shaw's design. By 1885, the practice had spread to 3 adjacent counties. By 1895, what the Territorial Archives called the Frontier Substable System had become standard practice for high-altitude ranches throughout the region, reducing winter livestock mortality by a documented percentage that the records of the period describe as significant. Eleanor Shaw expanded her own system over those years, connecting the original chamber to a root cellar and to a spring-fed cooling rooms that maintained a stable low temperature without any external energy input beyond the daily cooking fire. She did not build these additions quickly. She built them correctly, following the same principle that had governed every decision she had made since October of 1878, not what was fastest, but what the material and the physics together would sustain indefinitely. She lived in that cabin for 40 more years. She outlasted the sawmill that had been Holt's primary financial leverage over the valley. She outlasted the stage line for which her horses had been considered both a hazard and a prize. She outlasted most of the men who had stood in her kitchen in November of 1878 or ridden past her fence in October of 1878 or signed their names to an ordinance designed to leave her with no choices. She outlasted them by living simply and building things that did not require anyone's permission to work. When the cabin was finally demolished in the 1940s, To make way for a county road project, the demolition crew found what lay beneath it. The foreman stopped the work when his crew hit stone at a depth that the construction survey had not anticipated. He climbed down into the excavation himself and stood in the chamber for a long moment before he called the project engineer. The engineer came and spent an hour in the chamber with a measuring tape and a flashlight. He noted the dimensions in his field book. He noted the condition of the limestone arch, which bore no sign of settlement or deformation after more than 60 years of supporting the weight of the structure and the Montana winters above it. He noted the ventilation conduits, which were unobstructed. He ran a piece of paper near the intake opening and watched it flutter in the direction of the airflow, which was still moving, still following the pressure differential that a dead woman had designed into the earth in the autumn of 1878. He noted the walls. He noted that there was no visible degradation in the fired clay surface. He ran his hand along a section of it and found it as smooth and solid as the day it had been finished. He noted that not a single structural element showed any sign of failure or the beginning of failure. He could find no rot, no fracture, no settlement that would have required intervention at any point in the structure's operational life. He wrote in his field notes in the plain language of an engineer who has no interest in drama structure, appears to have required no maintenance since original construction. Condition excellent. The State Historical Office was notified. A record was filed. The chamber was documented in photographs measured to the inch and then closed and covered by the road that needed to go through. A bronze plaque was installed at the edge of the road near the location. It does not mention the ordinance. It does not mention Walter Holt. It does not use the words widow or struggle or triumph or any of the words that people reach for when they want to turn a person's life into a lesson about perseverance. It lists the dimensions of the vault. It notes the calculated thermal efficiency of the original ventilation design. It gives the date of original construction and the date the structure was found, and it notes the condition, no maintenance required. It identifies Eleanor Shaw by name, followed by the word engineer. It frames her story not as a victory of the heart, as a victory of the mind. The horses are long gone. Garrison and Bess and Owen the colt, who grew into a horse that worked Eleanor's freight route for 14 years without any notable complaint. The wolves are a memory. The valley changed as valleys do, and the things that drove those winters became the subjects of old men's stories, and then the subjects of their grandchildren's history lessons, and then simply the past, which is where everything arrives eventually. But the limestone arch and all the decades it stood below the Montana ground did not shift by a measurable amount. The clay walls did not crack. The ventilation conduits did not close. The structure simply continued doing what it had been designed to do in the absence of its builder, in the absence of anyone to maintain it, because it had been built in alignment with the forces that govern the physical world. And those forces do not change because a person is no longer present to oversee them. That is what Owen Shaw had been teaching his daughter since she was old enough to kneel beside a model made of wet sand and watch a candle flame lean. Not how to fight the earth, how to work with what the earth already wants to do. The plaque sits beside a county road in a valley that most people drive through without stopping. Most people do not read it. Some do, and they stand beside it for a moment with a particular expression, the expression of someone who has just understood something that cannot be adequately summarized, and then they get back in their vehicle and continue on their way. The expression is worth something. Eleanor Shaw would have found it sufficient. She was never much interested in being remembered. She was interested in what worked. What she built worked. And in the end, that is the only argument that has ever mattered in the places where the winters are long and the ground is deep, and the difference between surviving and not comes down to whether you understand what is under your feet. She understood.